And hello and welcome to my next interview on Inspire the Mind. And I'm really very happy to welcome Eleanor Byrne. And I came across Eleanor's work because she wrote a really interesting blog for our Inspire the Mind website. And I wanted to hear more about her thoughts on grief and many other topics. So welcome, Eleanor.
Hi, Rachel. Nice to speak with you.
Yeah, thanks for joining. So, Eleanor, just so listeners can have a little bit of a sense of you and your life, just tell us where you are right now, where you're living, who's in the house, just a little bit of context and setting. Are you married, children, where are you living? That sort of sense.
Cool. Well, just me in my flat, as it has been since the start of the lockdown. So it's been pretty solitary time, but an enjoyable one at times. So I'm based in York, up in the north. So I'm at the University of York, just finishing my PhD. So submitting that before Christmas in theory. So just finishing now. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Yeah. I'm in the Department of Philosophy, so I'm kind of straddling a few different disciplines in the way that philosophers sometimes do. But principally, as I am a philosopher by training.
Okay. So, just sort of rewinding, I want to sort of trot through your education. I mean, you obviously presumably read philosophy at university, but before that, where were you brought up? Were you also up in the north, or is that where you come from originally? Or
yeah, I've been in the north my whole life, but different parts of it. So started off in the west, so I grew up on the Wirral Peninsula, on the other side of the River Mersey to Liverpool.
Mm-hmm.
And then later on, kind of through teenage years and so on, I was near Warrington in Cheshire.
Oh, I know, Warrington Bank Keys.
That's the
I know. Yeah, my parents have a house up in the Lake District, so I know Warrington.
Yeah,
absolutely.
As a teenager, and then came to York when I was 18 for university, and I've been here ever since, nearly a decade now. So yeah, very much kind of a Yorkshire a Yorkshire woman now, I'd say.
Okay, but you haven't got a heavy Yorkshire accent.
No, not yet. Well, certain contexts that'll come out, I think, in the taxis with the taxi drivers and so on. It's contagious, isn't it?
Okay, lovely. And so you read philosophy at York. Is that how you started on the philosophical journey? Just tell me a little bit about that. Well, what drew you to philosophy in the first place?
Yeah, so I didn't do philosophy at school, but I did sort of philosophy of religion and religious studies. And so I started reading the typical things that get people interested in philosophy, I think. So some of the things that as you progress in your philosophical education, you become a bit embarrassed of. So the classic new atheists and all that sort of thing.
Oh, just unpack that a little, because I don't really know anything about philosophy. I mean, even the philosophy of religion, I wouldn't even know exactly what that means.
So I studied Christianity and Islam in my philosophy of religion course. So those sorts of things, kind of ethical issues as well, really popular, I think, things like euthanasia and whatever. But I stumbled across a book by Jules Evans. I don't know if you're...
Oh, I love Jules Evans. He's brilliant. Yeah, I do know his work.
Yeah, so I think it's his Philosophy for Life book, which I think I probably still have somewhere on the shelf. So that was all about how ancient philosophy really helped him overcome his own mental health struggles, which is, I guess, super relevant for our conversation today.
Yeah, he loves the Stoics, doesn't he? Is that right? I seem to remember.
So, yeah, he kind of did a survey of Stoics, people like Marcus Aurelius, who I love, Epictetus, all of these kinds of people, and talked about how that helped him overcome his anxiety that was induced by kind of psychedelic drugs, I think, in his case.
Well, you've already taught me something, because I've never known how you pronounce Epictetus, because doesn't he say something like it's not to do with circumstances, how we respond to circumstances, which I suppose is a kind of core message of cognitive behavioral therapy. I think that's Epictetus.
Yeah, great. So yeah, that's another thing that Jules talks about in the book, is how the ancient Greeks influenced subsequent development of CBT.
Yes.
So yeah, all about kind of changing the attitudes, the attitudes that shape the behaviors, rather than responding to the things that we have no control over, right? So focusing on what is in our control, namely our emotional
Sure.
response to things. I think modern Stoics are a bit more nuanced about this kind of thing, but I think the principle behind it is still really interesting and important for lots of therapeutic contexts.
Sure. And were you attracted to Jules Evans's work because you also were finding life tricky and a bit anxious yourself, or you were just more from a kind of intellectual point of view you were interested?
I think the two kind of go together for a lot of people.
Yes.
So I think I've always been quite a sort of thoughtful, quiet, pensive, anxious type. So I think
You seem so smiley.
so these things kind of interest me. And that base level of understanding and empathy, I think, is a kind of nice springboard for a lot of people to say, okay, well, what maybe makes sense here, what maybe is being missed in the way that we talk about anxiety, depression, whatever else. And that kind of philosophical supplement, I think, really interested me.
I think I think you really nailed it there. That sort of making me think about my own interest in psychological well-being and how my own experience again of severe depression and 2 very severe depressive episodes and ongoing anxiety and managing it, and how that has also led to a kind of intellectual curiosity and a sort of hunger, really. I think maybe it's one of the reasons I really enjoy these chats is sort of I suppose philosophy, philosophos, I mean, love of knowledge. You want to know more in that kind of, well, I suppose a philosophical way. I mean, I don't know what would you say that really means, sort of adding in a philosophical approach?
Yeah, well, I think the beauty of philosophy is that can mean very different things for different people, and that you can kind of question things in various different ways. Interestingly, a colleague of mine, I saw he did a tweet yesterday and said, well, after years of studying philosophy, has anyone's personality kind of at the fundamental level changed? And it was interesting reflecting on that myself. And I said, well, I think it kind of exacerbated traits that were already there, which I think for me is a kind of suspiciousness. So not trusting what seems obvious to you. So I mean, this translates over to studying philosophy of psychiatry and medicine, is that not just trusting the concepts that are already kind of laid out to you from the media and when you speak to a GP or whatever, but thinking, well, is that really how it goes? Is that really how it feels? Is this really the mechanism going on here? So just kind of looking at things with a critical lens, I think, and thinking, is something being missed here? So I think that's what philosophy means to me.
So it's sort of almost like really starting back at the beginning, like first base, like just because we've got, decades of, medical thinking in a certain direction, if I step right back, or almost like I'm a Martian landing on Earth, and would that be a kind of a good analogy?
Yeah, interestingly, you sound kind of like a Husserlian, which won't mean anything to you. There's a branch of philosophy called phenomenology that looks at the study of experience and the study of the structure of experience. And Husserl was a mathematician, philosopher, kind of polymath. And he spoke about this epoché or epoche, everyone pronounces it differently.
Again, you see, I've learned that because I've often seen it written with, it's got a funny little accent at the end.
Yeah.
I've never known how you're supposed to pronounce that.
Nor me. I say epoché, but I'm sure lots of people will shake their heads at me. But so this was all about bracketing presuppositions. So kind of shaking yourself, waking up from the kind of the context that you live in that shapes all of your perceptions and attitudes, and just bracketing all of that off and thinking, right, what's the phenomena in front of me? What's the experience?
Right.
So,
yeah. How interesting. Yeah, because you in the blog you wrote for us, there was that phrase, and again, I don't even know how you pronounce it, epiphrenology, whatever. Epiphrenology, is that, have I said it right?
Phenomenology, do you mean?
Oh, that's what I mean. Sorry.
Yeah, that one.
Phenomenology. So what does that actually mean, phenomenology?
So it's just the study of phenomena, right? So the study of experience as it presents itself to you.
Okay. So I suppose, and again, just spooling back to cognitive behavioral therapy, that same sense of questioning things. So, I mean, one of the things that I try and do, and I still find it really hard, is like questioning my negative thoughts and questioning the feeling, and even questioning, did the feeling come first or did the negative thought come first? And, you know, I find it, I actually think it's really hard questioning things. And it is, I don't know how you find this personally, but I do attempt to step back myself, and as you say, sometimes just be like an observer. What am I saying here? It does help, and I've got better at it, but it is quite hard, I suppose. Our more normal human experience is that we're really kind of caught up, and we don't really step back and observe. We're not sort of really, well, we're not really taught to do it at school, or in everyday sort of life, maybe.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly difficult to separate very fundamental things, like even perception of objects, from really rich, emotionally loaded aspects of our life. So, you know, you might see a knife, which just seems like a plain object in and of itself, and you can straightforwardly say, you know, I'm perceiving a knife, but really, in our own personal experiences, those things are imbued with our past experiences, our emotional associations with those sorts of experiences, what we think that object is for. So I might look at a knife and feel kind of anxious. I associate it with kind of violence, or you know, even really simple things, just perceiving our environment can really it's a fully emotional or affective experience a lot of the time, and it's super difficult to separate all of those component parts, I think. So we experience things as kind of coherent wholes, don't we, that tell a story about our life and what we've gone through.
Sure. I mean, and you'll probably know the word for it, another good word, but this is sort of like, is it a Japanese approach, this idea of sort of adopting the eyes of a child? So sort of trying to imagine how a child might see something, or how a child would experience something. I can't quite remember the name of it, but I have read about it, and that can sometimes be quite a nice device to sort of just give yourself that space and slightly shed all that baggage that, as you say, you may associate with either an object or indeed something that's happening or an experience.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. I don't know what this word is. I'm interested now. I'd have to find it out.
Yeah, actually, I did a book called Singing in the Rain, and there were sort of 52 psychological exercises. I became interested in people sort of developing their agency and power. And one of them was, you know, how could you adopt the eyes of a child and sort of look at things in this kind of fresh way, and sort of almost put this huge backpack down of all the baggage that you bring. Anyway, I may remember all. I'll send you the book, and then you can see that. So we've gone down a really interesting sort of rabbit hole. Well, not really a rabbit hole, but you know, this sort of thinking about philosophy and how you came to it and what drew you to it. So I want to sort of move on a little bit. I mean, it's still kind of connecting, because I suppose it is an experience that we observe, which is just your work on grief. And, you know, again, starting at the beginning, what drew you to being interested in grief?
Yeah, so at York, I'm working on a project in the Department of Philosophy called Grief, a Study of Human Emotional Experience. So this is a project that my PhD supervisor got a grant for recently from the Arts and Humanities Research Council. So I mean, as is typical with philosophy, the aims of the project are super broad. So we're looking at what is the emotional experience of grief? What does it feel like? How is it structured? What is grief? What defines grief over loss, over depression? All of these types of questions. And one of the things that we're looking at later on towards the end of the project is how we go about separating kind of healthy grief from pathological grief. So that's how I became interested in it originally. And then as part of my PhD research, I did conducted.
Sorry, but just going back to that, you said how you became interested in it, but So it was going on, but was there something happening for you personally that drew you to the topic, or was it more, again, a sort of intellectual curiosity and it was happening, so you might as well jump on board what was going on, kind of thing?
Yes, I mean, I'd not done any work on grief prior to that. I'd also not experienced kind of really profound grief. So it's kind of a new venture for me, really. But one of the things that stood out to me was, so I did a study as part of my PhD thesis on chronic fatigue syndrome, or ME. And I asked those people if they'd experienced losses. And by far it was the most striking set of responses.
Wow, that's so interesting.
I think it was something like 87% of the people that I spoke to had explicitly mentioned grief, and they said, I'm grieving over my old self,
Interesting.
grieving over the things that I thought I would do. So it just it struck me, and it's become obvious in lots of different contexts as well, that grief isn't limited to bereavement. Grief is really integral part of lots of experiences. And we also spoke to Jodie Day, who runs a charity called Gateway Women, for women who are involuntarily childless. And grief is a huge part of that conversation there too. So yeah, it's just kind of struck me as I've started working on this kind of thing, how ubiquitous grief experience is.
Interesting. Yeah. And you really done my job for me, because you listed the whole series of questions that your work, and I was like, okay, I'd like the answer. Yes, what's the answer? What's the answer? What's the answer? I mean, sounds absolutely fascinating. I mean, can we just start sort of like, what does grief mean to you? I mean, how would you define it? What is grief?
Oh, what a terrible.
Yeah, I mean, you've got all of 3 minutes.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I mean, one of the things that has come up a lot in philosophy of grief is that grief is a process, often a narrative process. So how you kind of stitch events together as a narrative.
Interesting.
And, one of
so
the
it's
things
not a sort of one-off thing, it's a sort of ongoing, it's a kind of a way we make sense of a story that's happening to us. We say this is a story of grief, and we put all the bits together in that way.
Yeah, so Thomas Attig described grief as a process of relearning the world, which I think is a really nice example of.
Yeah, that's lovely
illustration of that process.
Yeah, and relearning in the sense that we shift as people, we become different people because of grief, or we see things differently, or maybe they're the same thing.
I think all of those things, and that's one of the ways that phenomenology can really help, I think, understand, is when you look at how pervasive an experience of grief is, and just how much it affects in your life. It's really striking. So it's not just losing, a concrete thing, like you lose a pen. When you lose a person, you lose maybe your social roles. So if you lose a child, am I a parent still?
Yeah, I lost my mum. Am I still a daughter?
Yeah. Am I still somebody's child? You have to renegotiate all of those things that are really integral to your identity and the way that you kind of move through the world, if you like. So a term that we like to use as phenomenologists, right? Being in the world.
Yes. But so do you think it's always to do with loss then? Grief, you've always lost something.
I think loss is a necessary part of grief, but I think that it's easy to underestimate how ubiquitous loss is. So the illness is a good example of this, right? So you might not typically think of illness as an experience of loss, but when you look more closely, you see that it's just filled with losses, lots of different types of losses.
But maybe it's getting very broad, because in a way loss is in everything. So I remember I had terrible sort of depression after one of the children, and I couldn't sort of understand it, because I thought, I've gained this beautiful child. And then this friend of mine said, yes, but you've lost freedom, you've lost flexibility, you've lost independence. So it's almost like there isn't any human experience without loss. I mean, that it's embedded in everything. Would that be fair?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really important point, and it raises a lot of conceptual issues, I think. So it kind of forces us to reconsider how we define certain concepts. So if we say, okay, well, maybe loss applies in this context, but also this one and also this one. So we have to really step back and think, okay, so how are we going to define something like grief, different types of grief maybe that require different types of losses, all of this kind of thing. But I think you're absolutely right to point out that it's not always as simple as kind of something being added or subtracted, and that, you know, life experiences in general are this kind of dynamic interplay of you know, gaining and losing, and it's not always sufficient to just say, well, you know, I've lost this thing. You know, you gain a child.
Yeah, hold that thought, Eleanor, because my battery's low, so I'm just picking up the laptop, and I'm just going to move to the kitchen where the charger is, and I'll put it on there. I hope we won't. So I just got I have to edit some of this. There we go. I don't want to lose you in the middle. Yes, I suppose where I'm getting to on that is the idea that if loss is sort of embedded in everything, then what's different about grief? Because if it's everywhere and almost every experience, as you say, is so rich and multifaceted and multidimensional, even joyous experiences. I read War and Peace over the summer, and Tolstoy's got this great line, and he said that there's no sadness which is completely unalloyed. There's always an element of joy, and there's no joy which doesn't have an element of sadness. And that really got me thinking. So yes, I suppose then my question is that if it's everywhere, then, you know, how is grief in itself in a way different?
Yeah, I think it's a great reference there. I adore Tolstoy. I think it's brilliant. Yeah, I think one of the things that can really help is looking at the structure of the loss itself, and whether, as we said with the quote from Thomas Attig, whether or not that loss forces you to relearn the world, and you have to radically revise your kind of fundamental way of being. So yeah, you know, your identity, I think, fundamentally is crucial here. So can I move forward? What do I have to kind of reinvent of myself? All of these types of experiences that make certain losses more profound than others. So before I said, if I lose a pen, right, that's a loss, but it doesn't really mean anything. I don't have to revise my commitments, my habits, my values, any of those sorts of things. But if I'm to lose a partner, a parent, a child, then obviously that's a lot more profound. There's a brilliant book by Sonali Dharani-Yagala, I think is how you pronounce her name, called Wave, which is absolutely heartbreaking. So she lost her entire family in the Boxing Day tsunami. So her, both of her parents, her husband and her children. And there's some of the passages in that book make that kind of world-shattering experience really salient. So she says, well, what's left of me? You know, I think one line is, the possibilities of my children still linger in my home. So she's saying, you know, this is the home that my children lived in, and it was imbued with not just their present, but what I expected of them, of their futures, right? And now all of that stuff isn't going to happen. So what is going to happen? There's just a big blankness ahead, right? All of the things that you anticipated now they can't mean anything.
I like that. I mean, you're really making me think, and I think that's actually got a lot of clarity to it as well. And in that grief is it's to do with the sort of intensity of it and the degree to which it gets you. Sorry, couldn't just. I can do it later. Thank you so much. Sorry, trying to keep the noise. Yeah, just that. Yes, the idea, how intense it is and how, to what extent it gets you to change how you perceive the world, and indeed, as you say, your own identity. I was trying to think how that what that means for me in terms of my mother's loss. I suppose what I would say is that the other thing that I think I'm struck by is this idea of a process and that it's ongoing, because I mean, I know there's the sort of stages of grief idea and the 5 stages of grief, which I think has been rather sort of rejected now in psychological, it's overly simplistic, and that, for example, anger can pop back and forward. It isn't as though you're just angry at the beginning and then you sort of come to terms with the anger. But I think it does have validity in terms of this idea of kind of an ongoing process and a movement and a kind of constant trying to sort of imagine. Sorry, Yasmin, don't do it now. Sorry, I'll do it later. Sorry, so I've got to do this for work. If you just leave everything. Thank you so much. Sorry, I'm just sharing the kitchen. Sorry, Francis, I'm sorry about this. Anyway, where were we? Yes, so I think that's important. That's something that I hadn't thought of, is the kind of ongoing processing, that it's not any one thing. It may mean different things at different times. Mm-hmm. But I suppose, well, what are your thoughts in terms of, obviously we've just, still kind of living through a pandemic and coming out the other side of a pandemic, but an awful lot of people have felt loss. So I suppose, having at least attempted to define it, do you have any sort of thoughts or strategies or consolation for people, or ways that they might process loss in a way that might be helpful for them?
Gosh, it's quite the question.
It may not be your field so much, to sort of be more kind of self-helpy, but
I suppose as a philosopher I need to know my place, but I think one of the things that I have looked at in my work is disenfranchised grief. So I think one of the things that I have tried to do is make some types of grief in some contexts less disenfranchised. So
what does that mean, disenfranchised?
The grief that isn't recognized as grief, right? So you can't process it. So
okay,
they're in the work on chronic fatigue syndrome. So I think there's a lot of people there that are experiencing grief that maybe don't have the tools to recognize it as such, and that impedes their progress working through this process, readjusting, deciding what bits to let go of, what bits to continue holding on to, all of those types of things. So I think fully recognizing grief is probably
a really good start in a way.
Yeah.
So what you deny or resist kind of in a way persists more than what you kind of acknowledge and embrace. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I think having the tools to talk about the experience is a really important starting point, right?
Right. I mean, what sort of tools, or what kind of?
So I think in chronic fatigue, depression is a huge part of that conversation, and there's a lot of people who can be quite defensive about their emotional struggles, sometimes with very good reason, because a lot of people are just going to tell you that you're just depressed. I mean, that's a ridiculous thing to say for lots of reasons, but that's that's a way that people talk about depression. And I think so. Some people said this in my study, right, that they hold back on talking about parts of their emotional life, and that it's harder to admit psychological difficulties because they're kind of on the defense. But if you can say, okay, well, those emotional processes, that's me adjusting to losses.
Right.
Really put a new spin on it and help people to understand what they're going through, what they're feeling, and why they're feeling it. Like you said about, I don't know what caused this feeling, or I don't know which bit came first, all of those sorts of things. I think grief is a really useful tool there.
So that's a combination of being sort of opening up and being acknowledging and aware of the truth of what's happening to you, rather than sort of trying to sort of brush it under the carpet, but also that giving people actually an idea and a concept, which it could be, as you say, that depression is about loss and that there's a grief there, which you might not have even thought on the surface that you had anything either to grieve about or that you'd lost. Even that example I gave of my own experience of not imagining there was any kind of loss involved with a joyous thing like having a child. I like that I can see that could be very helpful. So yeah, any other thoughts of sort of ways to process or think about grief that could be very practical for people listening?
Oh, as a philosopher, I'm not very good at the practical. Took me many years to pass my driving test, so it's not really my fault.
No, okay, that's fine. I think, yeah, I suppose the way I'm thinking about your work is more that it's concepts and ideas. Maybe that's the point about more being a philosopher, that in that way it's helpful, because they're what you come up with in a way is new ways of thinking about things, which is not quite the same as, go for a run or, eat some oily fish, but it's a new ways of thinking, really.
Yeah, kind of breaking free from the paradigmatic ways of thinking about these things as well, that I think some people can be, they can restrict our ways of understanding ourselves.
Yeah. Do you think so when it comes to sort of mood disorders, and we're called Inspire the Mind, so very interested in the workings of the mind, do you think that there are ways we could be rethinking how we even think about mood disorders or mental illness that are, you said what's the word, paradigmatic, so i.e. a paradigm, i.e. a model that we're using? Are there right now sort of fresh ways of thinking that you think maybe we could reframe how we look at mood disorders?
Yeah. I haven't done any work on this yet, but I'd be interested to, because it made me think at the start you mentioned agency. I think that's a really interesting and tricky topic here that some people in philosophy of mental health have touched on a little bit. So I think untangling kind of agency, blame, responsibility, all of those sorts of things are really important. And it struck me that even just in the past decade or so, we kind of, as a society, shift between different ways of understanding mental health and that are more or less kind of attached to our agency and our responsibility, or reduced to workings of the brain and all this kind of thing. So I remember talking to some friends of mine a few years ago and just saying, oh, I feel a bit lonely. And there may have been good reasons for that, and there may have been things that I could have done had I had the opportunity that could have snapped me out of that loneliness, right? So in a way, it's very circumstantial. And I remember them saying, oh, well, have you gone to the GP about it? And it just struck me that, this is very much a different way of understanding mental illness than the very sort of the blaming view that we may have had 20, 30 years ago. Well, this is just down to you. This is your mind, the thing that you have complete control over. And, not like bodily diseases where this is just a foreign invader that's just struck you out of nowhere and you have no power over.
Yeah. So the old pull yourself together versus actually something might be happening in your brain and maybe you could get some medical help.
Yeah. I think there's both of those two extremes are unhelpful in various contexts, right? And it's knowing exactly what to say about the dynamic interplay between those two things that I think is
I quite agree. I think there's a really interesting spectrum, and neither extreme is helpful. But I did get very interested myself in this idea of things that people could do on their own without have to recourse to a psychologist or an expert or a psychiatrist or a GP, because I work alongside a lot of mental health charities, and I run various Singing in the Rain and Walking on Sunshine workshops, and there are lots of sort of little psychological or physical sort of techniques that people might find helpful. And I went very much down the agency route about, you can empower yourself and there is things you can do. And I think that is true, but I then slightly reversed out of it, because I became more and more interested in the context. So, you know, it was obvious that people suffering real social deprivation or unemployment or poor housing, so that you know, what was happening to them psychologically was very much rooted in the context. And I could tell them to take up all these good tips and strategies, but actually if they were living in a, you know, dreadful asbestos ridden moldy flat on the 30th floor with no access to any green space, you know, they'll so yeah, I think it's a very interesting area. And there's some that I'm not sure I know the exact answer. Maybe there isn't an exact answer, and you do need to be quite skilled, you know, diagnosing somebody with a mental illness to sort of take into account all these sort of variables. You know, is it the context they're in? Would they be better going off to see somebody in social services? Well, they probably would as well, to get the housing sorted, i.e. there isn't something wrong with their brains so much as the circumstances that they're in.
Yeah, I think we're learning increasingly that there's a dynamic interplay between those two things as well. So like people at King's, like Carmine Pariente, immunopsychiatry work, that shows us that, you know, going through various life stresses, like intimate partner violence, childhood trauma, all of those things can really kind of change how our bodies are working, how our immune systems function, our gut-brain relations, all those sorts of things. But yeah, I mean, this is stuff that we're learning more and more about.
Yeah, no, I think it's fascinating.
It's incredibly interesting, yeah.
Even something like stress and seeing how that affects the microbiome, and then a stress microbiome, in fact, can also feed back into you being more trigger happy, you know, more responsive to stress. So it's not a one-way street. It's a kind of constantly, the two, as you say, what was your phrase? Something dynamic.
I think it's a dynamic interplay.
Dynamic interplay. I'm going to sound really much cleverer than I am, really, by some of these good phrases. Dynamic interplay. So just still sort of fitting with this sort of this topic of the philosophy of psychiatry. I mean, what does that really mean? Sorry to be rather stupid again.
No, not stupid at all. We're doing a new thing. But we don't know how to define ourselves either, so it's totally fine. So I suppose there's lots of different ways that you can do the philosophy of psychiatry. One of the more popular subjects of discussion, I think, has been looking at diagnostic criteria, criticizing them, trying to disentangle the various different ways of understanding what diagnostic criteria are, what they do, picking holes in them, pointing out where maybe they're not quite right or they're missing things. So that's a really popular area of the philosophy of psychiatry.
But I'm not sure I quite understand. So is it philosophy as in questioning? Does that what it really just means, questioning in a way? Or it's just, or is it back to sort of rethinking and starting from first base? You know, how can we? I mean, diagnosis is a problem, isn't it? Because we don't have blood tests, we can't check chemical levels in people's brains, so it's self-reported, and somebody says, you know, they tick a lot of boxes on a form, or ring, you know, 1 to 5, are you feeling less or more positive? So it is a very it's quite a vague area, I suppose. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things that philosophy can help do is take a step back and challenge the concepts that become so entrenched and that people get so used to. And I mean, psychiatrists are very, very busy doing, you know, speaking to patients and treating patients, diagnosing patients, all that kind of thing. But a philosopher can kind of come along and say, well, you know, you say depressed mood is a necessary condition for a depression diagnosis, but what do you mean by depressed mood? And a lot of the time, the clinicians rely on their kind of intuitive judgment there, right? But if we take a step back and think, okay, well, how do we define depressed mood? What is that? How do we distinguish it from various other negative moods?
Freud had that phrase, ordinary human unhappiness.
Yeah, I mean, it's not clear. It's never made clear. And a lot of the time, practically, clinicians are operating on their experience and their intuitions, and that can do a lot, but it's really worth scrutinizing these things, I think.
So would you like to see the criteria being different, or is just more you'd actually like to see some actual changes in how we diagnose mood disorders?
I think they're changing all the time, which is one of the great things about them, is that there's constantly panels of people looking at how we should revise the criteria. So as part of the grief project in our department, we hosted a Zoom. It's one of the good things about the lockdowns is that we've changed to doing things over Zoom, so we could speak to some people in the States or whatever that we never would have been able to speak to otherwise. So we had Catherine Shear, who is a psychiatrist in the States who specializes on grief. And she was part of the panel of people that called for a pathological version of grief to be included in the DSM.
Okay.
So which is fascinating. So that was first complicated grief and then later became prolonged grief disorder.
And you think that's helpful because it gives people a name for what they're going through, or it's helpful because it helps other clinicians recognize a kind of a pattern that is quite, it's useful to know that other people have been through it?
I think principally it's helpful because it can direct treatment options. So this is one of the things that Catherine Shear spoke about. So therapy for depression, like cognitive behavioral therapy, may have helped these people to some extent, but if you can tailor their therapies to be about grief specifically, then those people ended up recovering a lot sooner. So if you can refine, I mean, this is another debate to be had, right? What do diagnostic criteria do? How do we distinguish conditions, or on what basis? You might say, well, based on treatment options, how we treat them. So you might differentiate between depression and prolonged grief disorder on the grounds that this person responds better to grief-tailored therapies than, say, talking therapies about, or CBT, something like that. So, yeah.
And what would you say to the sort of the counter argument that, because we've got so many different disorders and conditions that we're diagnosing people, and often the main answer is medication, and that we've come up with far too many conditions, we've become far too specialized, and that's a problem.
I guess that there's a big problem with medicalization and reification, all those types of things. So I think being flexible is important here, but yeah, I don't know. They're important questions. I don't have the answers to them, but
yeah, I mean, there is a big debate. I mean, and people are quite sort of heated on both sides of the debate. So that, whatever it is, the DSM manual, is it the diagnostic and
statistical manuals? Yeah,
that's it. Diagnostic and statistical manuals. That, I mean, I think roughly when they first were sort of developed, I don't know, is it about the 50s or 60s? I'm not quite sure, but there were roughly, again, I'm a bit shaky on my history, but generally speaking, there are far more disorders now than there were. So I think there are now around 3 volumes, and I think there are 600 or 700 disorders, and they used to be more like in their tens. So that is a big change, really, isn't it?
Yeah. So we're on, I think, the revised version of the 5th edition now of the DSM. So we had 5, and then they said, oh, well, maybe let's tidy some of these things up a bit.
Yes.
I always forget when things were done, but things like changing prolonged grief disorder to
I think
all those sorts of things.
One of the really shocking ones is, I think, homosexuality was thought to be a disorder, and that was but I think what I'm hearing, which is encouraging, is this idea that there are thoughtful people who are trying really hard to refine and constantly question, and with input from philosophers like you, to sort of constantly challenge and question and refine. And And we sort of have to, because it's not, you know, it's not like a physical illness. We haven't got the same diagnostic tools. So I don't really know what the answer is, other than to keep trying and keep refining and keep discussing. Yeah. Good, Eleanor. So yeah, I just we've talked a bit about grief, and we've talked a bit about your work on that. So just from a practical point of view, when will you finish, and will there be a book at the end of it, or what does it actually mean in practical terms?
Yeah, so I mean, as I said, hope to submit my PhD before Christmas, so that'll be done with any luck. So just working on publishing some articles. So I've had an article about chronic fatigue, and then more recently, based on the blog on ITM, a paper about long COVID and stigma. Yeah, so work on a few more articles, and work on proposals for future research, I think. So I'm really interested in particularly women's health issues and illnesses that affect women disproportionately. Chronic fatigue syndrome is a good example of those things, but also interested in things like endometriosis and polycystic ovarian syndrome and those sorts of endocrine diseases. So there's lots to be unpacked there, I think, philosophically. So I'd love to look at that more.
Okay, so sticking with a philosophical approach to different medical areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think the umbrella thing that unites all of the issues that I'm interested in is that they kind of sit at this uncomfortable in-between space between, you know, are they physical conditions, are they mental conditions, what's the difference between those things?
Yeah.
What causal factors are interesting here? All of those things, yeah.
Well, wonderful. Well, and more power to you. Eleanor, just one last question I always ask on our guests. So we're called Inspire the Mind, and I know probably lots of things inspire you, but is there one thing that really inspires your work and gets you up in the morning and you just want to keep going and keep researching and adding to our philosophical knowledge?
That is an excellent question. The one thing that inspires me. I mean, I could be really nerdy, and as a philosopher, just say learning more is what inspires me. So whenever you read, you know, I read a new article and I find a new way of looking at something, that's what inspires me. So I don't know if you've seen Dead Poets Society. I
love it. Yeah, fantastic. Yeah.
So when they're quoting and saying, you know, I stand on my desk to remind myself that there's always new ways of looking at things. That really strikes a chord with me. So just never getting comfortable in your perspective, never thinking, okay, I've figured out this landscape. No, you know, stand on your desk, look at it from a weird angle and think, well, what more needs to be looked at here, or what assumptions are kind of being left implicit for me that I need to unpack and kind of lay down on the table. So yeah, that's what keeps me going, I think, because it's never finished. It's an ongoing process.
That is lovely. I feel like I'm going to go and jump on the kitchen table. have a look at my own little world from a different perspective. Eleanor Byrne, philosopher, researcher at York, expert, and really have inspired my own mind here chatting today. So thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, delightful to speak with you.
Oh, well, good. I feel I've learned a lot. Eleanor, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.